Hi guys, today's video is going to be on the Knives by Hand Combat Kukri. I'll load the camera and then we'll go over the specs in more detail. Okay guys, give you the specs on this. The Combat Kukri weighs 22 ounces. The handle is 6.5 inches long. We'll get back to that in a moment. Blade is 13.25 inches and the overall length is 19.5 inches. That's going from pommel to tip in a straight line. It's going to be a little longer if you run it right across the edge. So one of the things that kept me from really getting into kukri for many years was the size of the handle. Here's a BSI, pardon me, 2 from Knives by Hand. The sheath is a work of art, by the way. We'll get into that next week. But you know, I have fairly wide hands, and it looks like, if you just take a picture like this, oh, that fits in his hand. Yeah, it fits, but it's hard to work at this size. You know, you have this center ridge here is meant to act as a stopper for your grip. And if you know, someone with a smaller hand than mine, if they're putting that ridge between the two middle fingers, then look how much, look how much space they have before their hand is, you know, of leftover grip they have, right? They have a decent amount. However, if you put that ring between the pinky and the ring finger down there, then you have all this nice grip area in the flare, which is good to have. But if you notice, my hand is now over the handle, and I'm actually choking up, and I have my thumb on top of the bolster there. So, you know, this is, you know, perfectly obviously well suited for a Nepalese person, but too small for my hands. So for instance, on the survival kukri, you have that one single finger twirl here, which I like. If you don't have a finger notch or groove, I should say finger groove. If you don't have a finger groove, have one, and then you have all the rest of the grip to marry to whatever size hand you have. And it looks like, oh, you have all this extra on the bottom. No, when the handle starts to flare, my hand is coming right to the beginning of the flare. So this fits my hand very well. The same thing, I'll show you on this side, might be easier. The same thing on the Combat Kukri. The handle, the part where it's beginning and end of the flare, actually fits right where my fingers would go. You notice the back when I grip it. Let me show in both kukris, maybe you can see better. The back of the hand is wider than where the fingers are. So you're going to need a wider area in back than you would in the front. Also, you want a good mechanical stopper, especially on something that's going to be a combat kukri. You want a good mechanical stop. Yes, the Gurkhas for years have used that little ridge in there, and they're perfectly fine with that, but they grew up with it. I didn't. You know, I grew up with knives and swords that had a big cross guard, and this is a pretty small cross guard for a hand, but it's something I'm used to, and I don't like to rely on just friction as this in this cut area in here. I mean, it helps, it's great, but I want a mechanical stop to keep my fingers from riding up onto the edge on a thrust. Now, there is some advantage on a curved blade compared to a straight blade on a thrust in terms of slippage. Because you have that curve, you know, if you would think of this blade as a whole circle, if I were holding a ring at this end and putting pressure on that end, you know, you could see there's no chance of my hand sliding up. So this is a part of a curve, part of a circle. So there is a little bit of limited resistance because it's on a curve. The point is going straight back to the pommel. That's where the pressure would be on a thrust. And my hand is less likely to slide up than on a straight sword. But you know what? It still will. You know, so I want some mechanical stop there. So there's a little bit of a finger guard here. It doesn't come above my finger, but it's basically reaching, say, 3/4 of the height of my forefinger bone. So that's better than nothing. There's a nice finger choil in here if you want to use carving tasks or whatnot to give you more pressure there. The material on this handle is micarta in this area and satisal wood in this area. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. You guys will let me know. It's a very pretty handle. And the main thing is it fits my hand. And the thing about a large handle, as long as you get the diameter right, if the length is too long, someone with narrower hands has an easier time using a handle that's a little too long than someone with big hands, or especially wide hands, would have grabbing a handle that's a little too short. So this is really will fit a wide range of hands. You see you have the mechanical fasteners in here, you have nuts and bolts. Looks like they're Allen head bolt nuts on this side, the head of them. And it's called the Combat Kukri because of this double edge. We'll get more into that in a minute. So as on the Survival Kukri, the one in the middle we reviewed last time, and the BSI 2, which I'll be reviewing next week, the Combat Kukri has a nice distal taper. It's a full tang, distal tapered. And what that means is, see the thick part of the middle here narrows down in thickness, but not in width. It's the full width of the handle. And to me, that's a nice balance between giving you a weight forward cut, which you need on a kukri, as you would on a rat tail tang. I'll show you a BSI 1 next week, which has a traditional rat tail tang, and it has that weight forward feel, but it gives you the strength of a full tang. A Western full tang is very often full thickness. If you look at a gross mesa or a lot of full tang modern knives, it'll be the full thickness from the front of the grip all the way to the back. What that does is it puts a lot of weight in the back, which is fine on a small knife. You get to a large blade like a kukri, you know, it's going to affect the balance negatively if you have that full thickness, full tang. So a distal taper tang is nice. And if you can see on the blade, there's also a slight distal taper from the blade going from the spine out into the tip, as you had on the Survival Kukri and on the BSI 2. So let's get to work on doing some comparisons. So ever since I got into kukris, I really have come to appreciate that in design, this is really a good multi-function tool. You know, it chops almost as hard as an axe of similar weight. It can do a lot of functions because of its long cutting edge, like a machete. Obviously, it's going to thrust better than a machete. When it comes to a double-edged kukri like this one, you also have the factor of it's going to have a point that is extremely better at thrusting than an axe, and it's going to be more maneuverable in the hand than an axe. The axe, with all that steel on the end and the balance, is very point heavy. You know, it's harder to stop this on a dime than it is on a kukri. Let me turn the camera up. Let me show you something. So an axe or hatchet, because of the way it's balanced, has most of its power chopping down, right? Having gravity help it. But one of the first things you learn with an axe is when you hit, clear your path, so if you miss, you're not going to hit your own leg, because these are very hard to stop on a dime. With a kukri, yes, you can stop down and you should make sure your path is clear. But, tilt the camera up here. One of the big advantages of a kukri is if you're clearing brush overhead, I better not, I'll get in trouble if I chop my wife's rosebud tree. But anyway, you can stop this on a dime hitting higher, you know, if you're chopping brush or a tree, much easier than if you're trying to do that with an axe where all the weight is in the head and you have very little below your hand. So here we are with a I believe this is a 18-ounce Bowie knife with a steel pommel. This is the cold steel leather neck Bowie. I want you to see how it moves this 6-inch log. Right. Now here is the Knives by Hand Survival Kukri, very similar weight. I think it's almost the same. You see how the same effort, it hits a lot harder because of the weight forward of that Kukri. The point, you know, will stab better than an axe, obviously, or other blunt weapons like a machete. The reason it's considered a combat kukri rather than a survival kukri is because of that double edge. You know, it gets a lot easier penetration. It's effort to get this to stick in the wood. And this calls to mind something from Matt Easton, who is from Scholar Gladiatoria YouTube channel. He's an antique arms dealer and historian. I recall him mentioning about the kukri, how and in other wars in the 19th century, getting through heavy winter clothing with a normal blunt-ish tip of a kukri was difficult when the British or other European troops had heavy winter clothing on. Where this double edge would not have this problem. As long as that's sharp, that's gonna penetrate clothing fairly easily because it cuts through it on both sides. Now, that's why I like, you know, Frank at Gonzalez at Knives by Hand sent me 4 kukris to evaluate, and he said pick one so for yourself. And I picked the survival kukri because, you know, I'm doing a lot more camping in the woods or surviving or hiking than I am fighting off guys with edged weapons. And if I had to, I usually have a pistol with me. You know, I'm a retired law enforcement. I can carry around the United States. So it's much more likely I'll use this as a survival tool. Another, let's say, pro and con between the two models, survival versus combat, is you can grab your hand up on top here, use this as a draw knife. Use it here with a sharpened spine if you want to go that route as a, what used to be called a card file. It's a scraper, right? So you can use that to smooth wood surfaces. It's hard to do that. You don't have a lot of potential here for that. You do, however, have enough of a full thickness spine to use this as an anvil if you wanted to cut wood and you were batoning, so they're moving things around. Let's do it this way. But if you're batoning through there, you could at least baton through wood, you know, from the end of the handle to the spine in terms of thickness. It was pretty thick, thicker than a 6-inch log. It's about 8, maybe more inches. So, you know, if you want a kukri that deals more in possible needs of thrusting, you know, if you're worried about bears while you're out camping and you can't carry a firearm for some reason, this is a good thing to have. You know, as you can see, it hits hard. I'm not worried about this thing breaking. It's 5160 steel. They buy this brand new. They don't get old leaf springs and forge them out with that, which may have cracks in it. And it's forged out. It's well constructed. Another thing with kukris and forging, Kevin Cashin is a knife maker and bladesmith who I have a lot of respect for. He would lecture at the Ashokan knife making school that I would lecture at also. You know, he's doing how to make knives, I'm doing how to use them. And even all these bladesmiths who are very technically involved would tell you that for most knives, you don't need to forge it out. Stock removal is fine. However, the kukri is an exception to that. Anything with a curve in it, either this way like a kukri or that way like a saber, you actually do want to forge it. It does help relieve stress. And another good thing about these, when you have a blacksmith do it, it's a lot easier for them to do zone tempering, where they're just getting the cutting edge hard. The tangs will be dead soft usually, and then have a transition area in this big, thick choil area or ricasso. And for a weapon that's going to take a lot of stress, you want full thickness in that ricasso area. I forget what it's called in Nepalese. In the West, we use the Italian term ricasso. You want a full thickness here because a lot of the stress is winding up in that area. So there's an advantage to having your blades forged if they're used for combat, or if they're going to be receive a lot of stress. For instance, if you were batoning with something like a survival kukri, you're hammering here, a lot of that stress is going into the handle, right at the juncture where the handle ends and the ricasso begins. That's why you see guys who, for some reason, have to baton with a folding knife. They'll drop the handle down, hold it like this, and go through very thin logs, hopefully, hitting on that spine if you have no other choice. Because you don't want that stress to wind up in that stress point. In this case, it would be, with a pivot pin that goes through. And these, folders are not really intended for batoning anyway. So, a comparison between these two blades. One thing I spoke to Frank about, I'll see if you can see it here, but you notice I have a little red half circle here on the base of the blade. What that's for is to just signify that you should put a chow in there, or a notch, a sharpening notch. And that acts as a spring. So if the blade is angled down that way and it's under stress, you get some flex, and it'll wind up in the notch or the chow, which is not tempered, right? It's not hard steel. It should be only hard on the edge. And if you get any twisting side to side or flexing, for instance, if you're batoning through wood and you're twisting this way or that way, or in a combat kukri, you hit and you get stuck in heavy bone and you're twisting or the body's falling away, the stress is going to be right where the cutting edge meets the thick steel, and you could get a split over there. I mentioned last time I did a video where the circus strongmen would grab a 2-inch thick phone book and rip it in half, and they're not ripping it at the 2 inches of full thickness, but they'd angle it so you'd have a slope in the front. So they're ripping just a few inches at a time. Back many years ago, when I was in the Boy Scouts and we were repairing aluminum canoes, if it had a rip in it, the first thing we'd do is drill a hole in the beginning and the end of the tear so that the tear could not continue propagating through the aluminum, through the thin sheet metal. So the same idea with that chow or that notch in traditional kukris. One thing I would have Frank do on the combat kukri is put the chow back in. The finger notch here is good, that finger choil, if you want to do fine carving tasks, but it doesn't relieve stress. So one adjustment I would have Frank do on both of these kukris is to put a chow back on there. If you see a little red half circle, that's my way to tell Frank to add a chow to this, the survival kukri. And then on the combat kukri, I would do the same thing in that area where the thin blade meets the full thickness of the blade stock. I would do another chow right in here to drive that thickness back towards the full thickness in this direction, so it acts as that spring to relieve stress. So the stress doesn't have a small, sharp surface area of a big division between thin cutting edge and thick full stock. Another thing I would do is change the scabbard. Let me go get that and I'll show you that. So another suggestion I would have for Frank is the combat kukri comes in a kydex sheath, and I'm guessing this is just a prototype pre-production. It's pretty thin stock on that kydex and does not offer really good retention, especially because you need that big opening in the back. The general design is good. I like how it's set up. It's actually 2 pieces of stock for the belt loop, another as the backer, and then the main body of the Kukri scabbard are these 2 pieces here. So in theory it's good, but this is kind of the thickness you would use on a much smaller knife, and I would like to see this thicker so you have better retention. And they do have plenty of thicknesses of Kydex available. So I would go with a thicker Kydex, especially for the main body that you need that retention. And then what you could do is pinch this closed a little better, and it would act as a retention grip surface. You'll probably need to, if you notice there's 2 Chicago screws up in this area, it may make it thick enough that you'll need Chicago screws all the way around. Although they do make different size tubes. I've made Kydex sheaths, and there's the ones we get in the States. You have 2 different size or length brass tubes here. I forget the proper name, but they have some that are like a 1/4 inch thick. These are the smaller ones, and it will make a difference if you can make the Kydex thicker. But other than that, I really like this. You know, a lot of the guys in my classes in law enforcement who saw this on my initial announcement of me getting these things really like the double edge for combat. A lot of these are Southern boys who, even civilians might be able to get away with something as big as this. But if you're out in the woods and you got bears around and coyotes and mountain lions and all kinds of nasties, wild boar can be very dangerous. You know, this is not a bad thing to have. You know, it cuts brush as well as a machete, but it stabs a lot better than a machete and has the hacking power for survival needs of a bit of a hatchet. So a good general design. I really like the big handles. Oh, one more thing on the handle. If you're thrusting, if you're doing a straight thrust with these, you tend to put a thumb grip up here, and then you see how much handle real estate you actually take up. If you're going to thrust on a straight thrust as opposed to a hooking thrust, which it's hard to do on a Kukri anyway, if you're doing straight thrusts, you want your thumb up on top of the spine, and the pommel is getting pressed against the heel of your palm. Having a big long handle like this is really helpful to give you a lot of purchase, a lot of real estate, a lot of grip and control over that blade if you can get your hand fully on that handle. So you see, this is not exactly, you know, too short, too long for me, is it? You know, for a straight thrust, this is a very good handle. So another thing to keep in mind, guys. Okay guys, let's talk a little bit about handle geometry, especially during the thrust. You know, I come from a background in Philippine martial arts. We start with a stick. So our thrust here, in order to get maximum contact with the stick on a thrust, you know, you want to have a full hammer grip, you know, and you don't want to deviate from that. The few times that we'll do a fencer's grip, we'll actually back it up by putting the pommel into the wrist. I was never really happy with that. I think this is probably some vestige of a stopgap measure. If you have a straight sword like a fencer's sword, maybe putting it there. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but I was never happy with that. You lose a lot of power by going into a fencer's grip with a straight stick. In the southern Philippines, I have a Malay parang here, but the handle is very similar on the barongs. So you have a wide bird's head pommel that tapers down, you know, towards the grip, or towards the point, or the far end of the, in this case, parang. Not much point on a parang. There isn't a barong. But you can see why you wouldn't want to thrust with this. One, there's no point on it to speak of. You might knock him in the head with this, but that's about it. But you wouldn't want your hand sliding up onto the cutting edge, right? because of that way that is tapered. And here's an old, 1940s or 50s Collins machete, and you'll see a very similar taper, wide going down to narrow. This at least has a better point on it, but that thick blade, if this is not razor sharp, it does not thrust as well as, something designed for it, and that handle really is not intended for a thrusting weapon. You'll see a lot of Western style blades closer you get to Manila that have a cross guard, as is a Bowie knife, but the idea of this built-in steel cross guard is something you'll see more likely in the Manila area and very close to it, or among, the Filipinos working for the Spanish as a local constabulary would have a saber type grip, right, with a knuckle bow guard. And I'm told that a third or a quarter of the sailors on the Spanish galleons going from the Philippines to the west coast of the Americas were Filipino. You can think of a naval cutlass of the 19th century as having a big bell guard, right? So that's what I'm used to on my swords. When you get to a Kukri, one of the reasons I wasn't too fond of them at first was the size of the handle. Just it's small for my hand. The other is you have a grip handle area that starts wide, great for swinging. You're not going to lose that on a swing, right? But it tapers down towards the blade, so not good retention. However, there's a little trick on this, on thrust, that I'll show you once I get some. I'll go get some visual aids. Okay, guys, the reason I'm holding this Frisbee is to show you geometry of a circle, right? So you have a straight stick where I'm pushing, right, on either side, and you can see how my hand would slide down that. If you have a circle and I'm pushing on opposite ends, I really don't have to grip the circle, grip the Frisbee. I can just press and my hand's not going to slide, right? The closer I get together, the more I have to rely on friction. If I'm pushing my hands towards each other, the more I have to rely on my grip and friction to keep my hands from sliding towards each other, right? So that curvature on a Kukri, the more curved it is, the more it functions a little bit. This is a toy boomerang, but it functions a little bit like that. Because the force is going across at that angle, is less likely to slip. If I take my hands off this, you see it does slip through and wedge a bit. But if I wrap my hand around it and don't let it slide, it really won't. So I think that's partially how the Gurkhas are able to get away with the thrust on the Kukri. One, their hands fit their handle very well. The other is that curvature. If you could see, if I hold the point parallel with the ground, you see how much of an angle I have on that handle. So if we look at, measure this with a, measure this with the circle here, I'm getting a little bit of support because it's not a straight line. My thrust angle is that way. Let's get a stick. So my angle of thrust is parallel with the stick, but my hand is about 45 degrees to the angle of thrust. So I am getting a little support in that handle. So I think that helps a lot in keeping you from your hand riding up onto the blade in a Kukri. I would still like to have a guard up front because that's what I'm used to. But I think this does a lot for the abilities of the Gurkhas, of the people who grew up with Kukris or Kukuris, to not have their hand slide up on the blade during a thrust. Okay, something to think about. Thank you, guys.